Some doors are not meant to be opened, but the night Elena Carter pushed through that one, she already knew she had nowhere else to go. Rain fell in relentless sheets, drenching her thin coat, soaking through to her skin. Each cold drop a reminder that the world outside offered nothing but rejection and closed signs and strangers who looked away too quickly. Her arms tightened around Lily, her 5-year-old daughter, who clung to her with quiet trust, small fingers gripping fabric that was already worn thin from too many days of running, too many nights without rest. The neon sign above the door flickered once before going dark behind her, and the moment she stepped inside, the noise shifted. It didn't stop. It changed. Conversations lowered just enough to make space for her presence, like a ripple moving through still water. She felt it instantly. The weight of eyes. Not curious. Measuring. The kind that judged without asking questions. The kind that had already decided she didn't belong. The room smelled of expensive liquor and something heavier beneath it. Something unspoken. Something that told her this wasn't a place people wandered into by accident. But she had no choice left in her. No more roads. No more doors. Only this one. Her boots left faint watermarks on the polished floor as she moved forward, slow, careful, as if one wrong step might shatter whatever fragile chance she had just taken. Lily stirred slightly in her arms, her head resting against Elena's shoulder, trusting, unaware of the tension that pressed in from every corner. And then Elena saw him. He wasn't the loudest man in the room. He wasn't even speaking. But everything, bent around him. Vincent Moretti sat at a corner table, half-shadowed, the dim amber light catching the sharp lines of his face. His posture relaxed in a way that didn't invite comfort, but commanded space. No one sat near him unless they were meant to. No one looked at him for too long unless they were ready for the consequence. Elena didn't know his name yet. She didn't need to. Power had a presence, and he carried it like it was part of his breath. Her steps slowed as she approached, each one heavier than the last, her mind whispering warnings she didn't have the luxury to obey. She stopped beside his table, her voice almost lost in the hum of the room when she spoke. "Can I sit here?" For a moment, nothing moved. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Vincent lifted his gaze slowly, not startled, not surprised, just aware. His eyes found hers, and something in Elena stilled, not out of fear exactly, but recognition. He saw everything in a single glance. The rain-soaked coat, the trembling edges she tried to hide, the child in her arms, the desperation she refused to name. He didn't rush to answer. He didn't soften. He let the silence stretch just long enough to remind her who held the power in that space. Then he leaned back slightly, his voice low, controlled, carrying without effort. "Sit." Elena hesitated for a fraction of a second before lowering herself into the chair, careful not to wake Lily, careful not to draw more attention than she already had. But the moment she settled, his voice came again, quieter, closer, like a shadow moving just behind her thoughts. "But you're not leaving after." The words landed without force, yet they carried more weight than anything shouted across the room. Elena's fingers tightened around Lily instinctively, her heart catching in her chest. She turned her head slightly, just enough to meet his gaze again, searching for something, clarity, intention, escape, but finding only certainty. He wasn't asking. He wasn't threatening. He was stating a fact as he saw it. Around them, the room had shifted in ways only someone paying attention would notice. A man at the bar straightened. Another stepped aside without being told. The staff moved quieter, faster, as if aware of something unfolding that didn't require explanation. Elena swallowed, forcing her voice steady. "I just need a place to sit for a minute." Vincent's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened, like he had heard the lie she didn't fully realize she was telling. "No one comes here for just a minute," he said, almost thoughtfully. Lily stirred again, her small hand slipping from Elena's coat to the edge of the table, her fingers brushing against the polished surface before, without hesitation, reaching toward Vincent's hand. Time stopped, not in a dramatic way, in a quiet, precise one, the kind where every movement suddenly mattered. Elena's breath caught, her instinct screaming to pull Lily back, to apologize, to fix something that hadn't even broken yet. But Vincent didn't move away. His gaze dropped to the small hand resting against his, and for the first time, something shifted. Not softened, not changed, just shifted. His fingers didn't close around hers. They didn't pull back either. They remained still, allowing the contact in a way that didn't fit the man the room had built around him. Elena watched it happen, confusion threading through her fear, because men like him didn't hesitate. They acted. They controlled. They decided. But this moment lingered, just long enough to matter. Outside, the faint sound of engines rolled through the rain, distant but growing, unnoticed by most, but not by Vincent. His head tilted slightly, listening, calculating. When his eyes lifted back to Elena, they were different now. Not kinder, not warmer, just decided. You didn't come here by accident, he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Elena felt it then. The thin line she had been walking since she opened that door. The moment where chance ended and something else began. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Vincent leaned forward just enough that his presence filled the space between them, his voice dropping to something only she could hear. You walked into my world, he said. A pause. Measured. Final. Now we see what that costs. If you stay on my terms, Vincent said, and the words did not rise above a quiet tone, yet they settled over Elena like something unmovable, something final, as the faint hum of engines outside grew closer through the rain, low and steady, like a storm that had already chosen its direction. Elena felt it in her chest before she fully understood it, that tightening sense that whatever had been chasing her had not stopped, had not slowed, and had not forgotten. Her fingers brushed against Lily's damp hair, smoothing it gently, grounding herself in the small warmth that still existed in her arms. I am not looking for trouble, she said carefully, her voice steady in a way that took more strength than she wanted to admit. Vincent watched her, not with suspicion, not with curiosity, but with something sharper, something that measured truth by silence rather than words. Trouble does not need to be looked for, he replied. It finds the people who run. The statement lingered between them, heavy and quiet. Elena did not answer. She could not, because he was right, and he knew it. A man approached Vincent's table then, his steps controlled, his posture respectful in a way that spoke of hierarchy without needing explanation. He leaned down slightly, speaking in a low voice that barely carried beyond the edge of the table. Vincent listened without interruption, his gaze never leaving Elena's face, as if whatever information was being delivered had already been anticipated. A single nod. That was all. The man stepped back, disappearing as smoothly as he had arrived. Vincent's fingers tapped once against the table, slow, deliberate. They are close, he said. Elena's breath caught before she could stop it. The words confirmed what she had tried to outrun, what she had refused to name. I do not know what you are talking about, she said, but the denial sounded thinner now, fragile in a way that did not hold under the weight of his attention. Vincent leaned back slightly, studying her as if the answer had already been given in the way her shoulders tensed, in the way her eyes flickered once toward the door before returning to him. You walked into the only place in this city where no one comes without knowing the risk, he said. And you brought a child. His gaze dropped briefly to Lily, who had now settled into the quiet comfort of sleep, her small hand still resting near his, her breathing soft and even, untouched by the tension that wrapped itself around the adults in the room. That tells me two things, Vincent continued. You had no other choice. And whatever is behind you is worse than what you think is in front of you. Elena swallowed, her throat tight, her mind racing through every possible way out of this moment and finding none that did not in the same way. I just needed a place to stay for a few minutes, she said again. But even she could hear the truth breaking through the edges of her words. Vincent did not argue. He did not correct her. He simply watched, letting the silence do the work for him. Outside, the sound of engines grew louder, closer now, the faint glow of headlights slipping through the rain-streaked windows, cutting thin lines of light across the dark interior. Conversations in the bar shifted again, quieter, more aware, as if the room itself recognized the approach of something unwelcome. Vincent turned his head slightly, listening, calculating, and then his attention returned to Elena with a clarity that left no space for misunderstanding. You have 10 minutes, he said. Elena blinked, confused. 10 minutes for what? His expression did not change. For them to walk through that door, he said calmly, or for you to decide you are not leaving this table. The choice hung there, simple in words, impossible in reality. Elena felt her pulse in her throat, in her fingertips, in the tight grip she kept around Lily, as if letting go even slightly would unravel everything she was holding together. "And if I leave?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Vincent's gaze did not waver. "Then you will find out what you were running from," he said. No threat, no warning, just certainty. Elena closed her eyes for the briefest moment, pulling in a breath that tasted like rain and fear and something else she could not name. She had been running for days. Miles blurred together. Gas stations passed without stopping. Roads chosen at random. Doors knocked on that never opened. She had told herself she could keep moving, that there would be somewhere, eventually, that would feel safe enough to stop. But now she knew the truth. There was no safe place. Only choices. And consequences. Lily shifted in her arms again, her small voice barely audible as she murmured something in her sleep. Something soft, something that did not belong in a world that had become this sharp, this unforgiving. Elena looked down at her, her heart tightening with a quiet, fierce determination that rose above fear, above pride, above everything else. When she lifted her gaze back to Vincent, something had changed. Not in him, in her. "If I stay," she said slowly, choosing each word with care, "I am not staying because I am afraid of you." Vincent's lips curved almost imperceptibly, not quite a smile, but something close enough to recognize. "Fear is not required," he said. "Understanding is." The headlights outside flared brighter now, cutting across the windows in sharp, moving lines as the engine slowed, stopping just beyond the door. The room held its breath. Elena felt the moment settle into place, heavy and irreversible. Vincent's voice came once more, low, steady, final. "Decide." And this time, there was no silence left to hide in. Elena did not move immediately, but something in her posture shifted, subtle yet unmistakable, as if the weight of running had finally settled into a single, irreversible decision. And when she spoke, her voice no longer trembled. "I am staying," she said, not loudly, not defiantly, but with a quiet certainty that seemed to echo louder than anything else in the room. And Vincent watched her for a long moment, as if measuring the truth of that choice against everything he had already seen before, giving a slight nod that carried more authority than any raised voice ever could. And in that instant the atmosphere changed again, not dramatically, not visibly, but in a way that could be felt in the stillness of the men around them. In the way the staff slowed their movements just enough to acknowledge a shift in control that needed no announcement, and outside the engines idled. The faint vibration pressing through the glass as silhouettes moved beyond the rain-streaked windows, figures, approaching with purpose, unaware or perhaps uncaring of what waited for them inside. And Elena felt her breath tighten, but did not look away this time, did not glance toward the door, because she understood now that whatever happened next would not be decided by those outside. It would be decided here, at this table, by a man who had already drawn a line she had chosen not to cross. And Vincent leaned back slightly, his fingers resting against the edge of the table in a relaxed posture that somehow made him appear more dangerous rather than less, his gaze shifting briefly toward the entrance before returning to her. "Then you follow one rule," he said calmly. "You do not speak unless I ask you to." And there was no harshness in the instruction, only expectation, as if it were the most natural condition in the world. And Elena nodded once, understanding that this was not about control for its own sake, but about something else. Something she could not fully name yet. And Lily stirred again, her small hand sliding slightly before settling once more near Vincent's, her presence grounding the moment in a way nothing else could. As the door opened, and the sound of rain grew louder for a brief second before it was cut off again, replaced by footsteps, measured and deliberate, entering a space that did not welcome them, but did not deny them either. And the room responded in silence, not fear, not submission, but awareness, as if every person present understood the importance of what was about to unfold. And Elena felt it in the stillness, in the way even her own heartbeat seemed to slow, focusing, listening, as the figures moved further inside, their presence sharp against the subdued elegance of the bar. And one of them spoke, his voice carrying just enough to reach Vincent's table without raising itself above what was necessary. "We are looking for someone," he said, and Vincent did not respond immediately, did not even look at them, instead reaching for the glass in front of him and taking a slow, measured sip as if the interruption had not yet earned his attention, and the pause stretched, deliberate, controlled, until it became impossible to ignore, until the silence itself began to answer the question that had not yet been acknowledged. And finally Vincent set the glass down with quiet precision, his gaze lifting, not hurried, not annoyed, simply present. "Everyone here is someone," he said evenly, his tone calm, but carrying an edge that suggested the conversation would proceed on his terms and no one else's. And Elena kept her eyes forward, her posture steady, aware of every movement in her peripheral vision but refusing to give anything away, remembering his rule, holding on to it like the only thread that kept her from unraveling. And the man took a step closer, not aggressive, not hesitant, but certain in his purpose. "A woman," he clarified, "with a child." And for a fraction of a second the air tightened, just enough to be felt, just enough to mark the moment where truth and danger brushed against each other. And Vincent's gaze shifted again, this time slowly, deliberately, landing on Elena with a weight that was impossible to misunderstand, not exposing her, not protecting her, simply acknowledging her presence in a way that said everything without saying anything at all. And then his attention returned to the man. "There are many women in this city," Vincent replied, his voice as composed as before, "and many children." And the answer was not a denial, not a confirmation, but something in between, something that left no clear path forward. And the man hesitated, just for a moment, as if recalibrating, as if realizing that whatever control he had expected to carry into this room did not extend as far as he had believed. And Elena felt it then, the shift of power not in volume or force but in presence, in the quiet certainty that Vincent did not need to raise his voice because the room already belonged to him. And Lily let out a soft breath in her sleep, her small fingers curling slightly, and Vincent's eyes flickered down again for the briefest moment, something unreadable passing through his expression before it settled back into the composed stillness that defined him. And outside the rain continued to fall, steady, unrelenting, as if marking time in a way that only those caught in the moment could truly feel. And Vincent spoke again, quieter now, but somehow more final. "If you are looking for trouble," he said, "you are in the wrong place." And the words did not push, did not threaten, but they landed with the kind of certainty that left little room for argument. And the man studied him for a long second before stepping back, the tension easing just enough to allow breath to return to the room. And Elena remained still, her heart steady now in a way it had not been before, because she understood something she had not when she walked in, something she had not even when she chose to stay. That safety was not the absence of danger, it was the presence of someone who could decide what that danger meant. And as the figures turned toward the door, the faint sound of engines shifting again outside, Vincent's voice came once more, low and close enough that only she could hear it. "You chose correctly," he said, and for the first time since she stepped into that room, Elena believed it. "Nothing ends when danger walks away," Vincent said quietly, and his voice carried no urgency, no relief, only a calm certainty that settled deeper than fear ever could. As the door closed behind the men and the sound of engines faded slowly into the distance, leaving the bar wrapped again in its dim golden light and controlled silence. Yet the tension did not disappear, it shifted, turning inward, settling around the table where Elena still sat, her arms wrapped around Lily, her breath steady, but her thoughts racing in the quiet aftermath of what had just passed, because she understood now that leaving had not meant safety, it had only delayed something. And Vincent watched her without speaking, as if giving her the space to arrive at that realization on her own, his fingers resting loosely against the glass in front of him, untouched now, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested control rather than comfort. And after a long moment he spoke again. "They will not stop," he said, not looking at her directly this time, his gaze drifting briefly toward the rain-streaked window, as if the city itself were part of the conversation. "People like that do not walk away empty." And Elena swallowed, her grip tightening slightly around Lily as the truth of his words settled in, heavier now because she had seen it for herself, felt it pressing against the edges of her choices. "I cannot stay here forever," she said quietly, her voice carrying a fragile balance between determination and uncertainty. and Vincent turned his gaze back to her, studying her again with that same precise attention that seemed to see beyond what she said, beyond what she tried to hide. "No one stays anywhere forever," he replied. "But leaving too soon is the same as never leaving at all." And the words lingered, layered in a way that made them harder to ignore than any direct warning could have been. And Elena looked down at Lily, brushing a strand of damp hair away from her face, grounding herself in the small, steady presence that reminded her why she had run in the first place, why she could not afford to make the wrong decision now. And when she looked back up, there was something steadier in her expression, something that had begun to replace fear with resolve. "Then what do you want from me?" she asked, and Vincent's lips curved slightly, not in amusement, not in satisfaction, but in acknowledgement of the question itself, as if it were the right one to ask, even if the answer was not simple. "Nothing," he said at first, his tone calm, almost dismissive. But then he leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering just enough to draw a line between them that only she could feel. "And that is exactly why you should be careful." And Elena frowned slightly, confusion threading through her thoughts. "I do not understand," she said, and Vincent's gaze held hers, steady, unyielding. "Everyone wants something," he said. "Money, protection, information, loyalty." He paused briefly, as if weighing the next words before letting them settle into the space between them. When someone does not ask for anything, it means they have already decided what they are going to take. And the statement did not feel like a threat. It felt like a warning, one that carried a weight she could not yet fully grasp. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the quiet stretching between them in a way that was no longer uncomfortable but deliberate, meaningful, as if something unseen was forming in the space between their choices. And then Lily shifted again, her eyes fluttering open slightly, blinking against the dim light as she stirred awake. Her small voice soft and uncertain. "Mom?" And Elena's entire posture changed in that instant, the tension in her shoulders easing just enough to allow warmth to return, her voice gentle as she responded. "I am right here." And Lily's gaze drifted around the unfamiliar room before landing on Vincent, her small brow furrowing slightly as she studied him with the simple honesty only a child could carry. And for a moment, time seemed to pause again, not with tension, not with danger, but with something quieter, something that did not belong in a place like this. And Vincent did not look away, did not retreat behind the distance he held with everyone else, instead meeting her gaze with the same calm stillness he had shown all night. And Lily tilted her head slightly before speaking again, her voice soft but clear. "Are you the one who helped us?" And Elena's breath caught, the question landing in a way she had not expected, because she had not yet thought of it like that, had not allowed herself to see this moment as anything other than survival. And Vincent's expression did not change, but something in his eyes shifted again, subtle, almost imperceptible. "I have not done anything yet," he replied, quietly, and Lily seemed to consider that answer for a moment before nodding slightly, as if accepting it without question, her small hand reaching out again, this time not hesitant, not uncertain, but deliberate, resting lightly against the table near his. And Vincent's gaze followed the movement, lingering there for a second longer than necessary before returning to Elena. "But I might," he added, his voice low, carrying a weight that felt different now, less like a condition and more like a possibility. And Elena held his gaze, searching for something she could trust, something she could understand, but finding instead a complexity that did not fit into the simple categories she had built to survive. And outside the rain continued to fall, steady, relentless, marking time in a way that felt both slow and urgent at once. And Vincent leaned back again, his posture returning to that composed stillness that seemed to define him. But the atmosphere around the table had changed, no longer driven by immediate danger, but by something deeper, something that had begun to take shape in the quiet aftermath of choice. And when he spoke again, his voice carried that same calm authority, but with a different edge now, one that suggested the night was far from over. "You can stay," he said simply. "But understand this." He paused briefly, just long enough for the weight of his words to settle before continuing. "Nothing you choose after this will be accidental." And Elena felt the truth of that statement settle into her bones, heavier than fear, heavier than uncertainty. because it meant that whatever came next would not be something she could run from. It would be something she had to face. And for the first time since she stepped into that bar, she realized that staying had not ended her story, it had only begun it. Trust is not given in places like this, it is tested, Vincent said, his voice low and steady, as if the words were not meant to persuade but to prepare, and Elena felt them settle into her chest with a weight that was both unfamiliar and undeniable. Because she understood now that staying had not earned her safety, it had only placed her inside a different kind of uncertainty, one that did not shout or chase but waited, watched, and decided, and she adjusted her hold on Lily slightly, feeling the warmth of her daughter against her, the steady rhythm of her breathing, a quiet anchor in a room that still carried tension beneath its polished surface. And Vincent observed the movement without comment, his gaze sharp but not intrusive, as if he noted everything yet chose carefully what mattered. And after a moment he reached for the glass again, lifting it with slow precision before setting it down untouched, as though the action itself served a purpose beyond the drink. And Elena noticed it, the restraint, the control, the way nothing he did was careless or without intention, and it unsettled her in a way she could not fully explain, because it meant that every word, every silence, every glance carried meaning, whether she understood it or not, and she drew in a quiet breath before speaking. You said nothing I choose will be accidental, her voice steady but searching. So what happens if I choose to leave now? And Vincent did not answer immediately, his gaze shifting, slightly, not away from her, but through the room, as if considering not the question but the timing of it. And then he leaned forward just enough to close the space between them without invading it, his voice calm, almost conversational. Then you leave knowing exactly what you are walking into, he said. And you accept that whatever finds you next will not be by chance. And Elena felt a chill move through her, not from fear alone but from the clarity of it, because he was not trying to stop her, not trying to convince her. He was simply removing the illusion that she still had options untouched by consequence. And Lily shifted again, now more awake, her eyes opening fully as she looked around the room with quiet curiosity, her small voice soft as she asked, "Are we staying here?" And Elena hesitated, the question simple, yet carrying more weight than it should have, because the answer no longer felt temporary, no longer felt like something she could define in minutes or hours. And before she could respond, Vincent spoke, his tone unchanged but his attention now directed toward the child. "For tonight," he said, and Lily seemed to accept that easily, nodding once before settling closer to Elena, her small hand once again resting near the edge of the table. And Elena looked at Vincent, something shifting in her expression. "Why?" she asked, not challenging, not accusing, but genuinely searching for something she could understand. And Vincent held her gaze for a long moment, the silence stretching just enough to feel deliberate before he answered. "Because you asked for a place to sit," he said simply, and the words echoed something from earlier, but now they carried a different weight, less about control and more about consequence. And Elena frowned slightly. "That is not the same as offering protection," she said, and Vincent's expression did not change, but there was a slight shift in his posture, something that suggested the conversation had moved into a different space. "I did not offer protection," he replied. "I offered you a choice." And Elena felt the distinction settle into her, sharp and precise, because it meant that whatever came next would not be something she could rely on, it would be something she had to navigate. And she nodded slowly, understanding more than she wanted to, and the room around them began to return to its quiet rhythm. Conversations resuming, movements continuing, but the atmosphere had not fully relaxed. It had only adjusted, as if everyone present understood that something significant had occurred and was still unfolding. And Vincent glanced briefly toward one of his men, a subtle motion that did not need to be spoken aloud. And within moments someone approached, placing a small glass of water on the table near Elena without a word before stepping away again. And she hesitated for a second before taking it, her fingers brushing the cool surface as she lifted it carefully, aware of how dry her throat had become. And she took a small sip, grounding herself in the simple act, in the normalcy of something that did not feel normal at all. And when she set the glass down, Vincent was watching her again, not intensely, not intrusively, but with that same steady awareness that made it Impossible to forget where she was, and after a moment he spoke again. "You are not from this part of the city," he said, and it was not a question, and Elena shook her head slightly. "No," she admitted, and Vincent's gaze lingered for a second before he continued. "You did not plan to come here." And again, not a question, and she hesitated before answering. "No." And Vincent leaned back slightly, as if confirming something to himself. "Then whatever brought you here was not small," he said. And the statement hung between them, inviting truth without demanding it. And Elena looked down at Lily for a moment, her fingers gently tracing the edge of her sleeve, gathering her thoughts, gathering her courage, before she looked back up, her voice quieter now, but more honest. "I thought I could keep moving," she said. "I thought if I did not stop, they would not catch up." And Vincent listened without interruption, his expression unchanged. But something in his stillness suggested he was not just hearing her words, he was understanding the space between them. And Elena swallowed, continuing, "But I ran out of places to go," she said, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than anything else she could have added. And Vincent nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging not just her words but the truth behind them. And after a moment he spoke again, his voice lower now, more deliberate. "Then tonight," he said, "you stop running." And Elena felt something shift inside her at those words, something she had not allowed herself to consider before, not because it was impossible, but because it was dangerous to believe. And she held his gaze, searching for any sign that this was temporary, conditional, fragile, but finding instead that same steady certainty that had defined every moment since she sat down. And for the first time, the possibility of stillness did not feel like weakness. It felt like something else entirely, something she had not yet learned how to trust. And Vincent's voice came once more, quiet but final. "Rest while you can," he said, "because tomorrow will not ask you what you want." And Elena knew, without needing anything more, that whatever came next had already begun. Morning does not wait for anyone, especially those who think they can outrun the night, Vincent said quietly, though there was no sunrise yet. Only the slow fading of rain against the glass and the subtle shift of darkness into something thinner, something that suggested time had passed even when the room itself remained unchanged. And Elena realized she had not moved for longer than she intended, her body still alert despite the quiet, her mind refusing to fully rest even as exhaustion pressed against the edges of her awareness. And Lily had fallen asleep again in her arms, her small weight heavier now, peaceful in a way that made everything else feel sharper by contrast. And Vincent remained where he had been, composed, still, as if time affected him differently, as if he existed outside the urgency that defined everyone else in the room. And Elena shifted slightly, adjusting her hold on Lily, careful not to wake her, her muscles stiff from staying in the same position. And Vincent noticed. Of course he did, because nothing in his presence went unseen, and he gestured subtly toward one of his men, a movement so slight it could have been missed, yet within seconds. A chair was brought closer, more comfortable, placed without interruption, without question, and Elena hesitated before moving, as if unsure whether accepting even that small gesture carried a cost she did not yet understand. And Vincent spoke before she could decide, his tone calm. "You cannot protect her if you cannot stand." And the words were simple, but they carried truth. And Elena nodded once before carefully shifting into the new seat, settling Lily more securely against her, the child barely stirring as she adjusted. And for the first time since entering, Elena allowed herself a small breath that was not shaped by urgency, not driven by fear, but by something quieter, something that felt almost like relief, and it unsettled her more than anything else had. Because relief meant she was beginning to trust something she did not fully understand. And Vincent watched her again, his gaze steady, not intrusive, but present in a way that made it impossible to forget him. And after a moment he spoke. "You are still waiting," he said. And Elena looked at him, confusion flickering briefly across her face. "Waiting for what?" she asked, and Vincent's expression did not change. "For this to end," he replied, and the words landed with a quiet precision that made Elena pause, because she had not said it, had not even fully admitted it to herself. But it was there, beneath everything else, that fragile hope that this moment would pass, that she would leave, that life would return to something familiar, something manageable, and she shook her head slightly, though the movement felt less certain than she intended. "I know it will not," she said, and Vincent inclined his head just slightly, acknowledging the shift in her understanding. "Good," he said simply, and the conversation might have ended there, but Elena found herself asking another question before she could stop herself. "Why are you helping us?" And the room seemed to still again, not dramatically, not noticeably to anyone else, but in a way that pressed against the edges of the moment, because it was the first time she had asked something that did not come from survival, but from something deeper, something more dangerous. And Vincent did not answer immediately, his gaze drifting for a brief moment toward Lily, then back to Elena, as if the answer existed somewhere between them rather than within him alone. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, but no less certain. "I am not helping you," he said, and Elena felt a flicker of something, frustration, disbelief. But before she could respond, he continued, "I am allowing you to stay." And the distinction mattered. She could feel it, even if she did not fully understand it yet, and she frowned slightly. "That is not the same thing," she said, and Vincent's lips curved faintly again, that almost smile that never quite reached warmth. "Exactly," he replied, and the answer lingered, incomplete yet deliberate. And Elena exhaled slowly, realizing that every answer he gave revealed just enough to keep her grounded while withholding enough to keep her uncertain. And it was intentional. It had to be, because nothing about him suggested carelessness. And Lily stirred again, her eyes opening slowly as she blinked against the dim light, her gaze drifting first to Elena, then to Vincent, and she watched him for a long second before speaking softly. "Are we safe now?" And the question settled into the space between them with a weight that neither adult could ignore, because it was simple, direct, and impossible to answer without consequence. And Elena's instinct was to reassure her, to offer comfort even if it was not entirely true. But before she could speak, Vincent did, his voice steady, calm. "For now," he said, and the honesty in it was not softened, not disguised, but it was not cruel either. It was measured, precise, and Lily seemed to accept it in a way only a child could, nodding slightly before leaning back into Elena, her small hand resting lightly against her mother's sleeve. And Elena looked at Vincent, something shifting again in her expression, because he had not lied, had not offered false comfort. And somehow that made his words easier to trust and harder to rely on. And outside the rain had slowed to a faint drizzle, the steady rhythm replaced by occasional drops that traced down the glass, and the city beyond remained quiet, waiting, as if holding its breath for what would come next. And Vincent leaned back slightly, his posture unchanged, but his presence no less commanding. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a different weight now, less about the moment and more about what followed. "You will not go back to where you came from," he said, and Elena felt the certainty in that statement before she even processed the words. Because he was not guessing, he was stating something he had already decided, and she held his gaze, her voice steady. "I was not planning to," she said, and Vincent studied her for a moment before nodding once, slowly. "Good," he said again, and the repetition carried more meaning this time, as if each confirmation brought them closer to something neither of them had fully defined yet. And Elena shifted slightly in her seat, her mind turning over everything that had happened, everything that had changed in the span of a single night, and she realized something then, something that settled into her with quiet clarity, that she was no longer thinking about leaving, not in the same way, not as an immediate escape, but as something distant, something that would require more than just walking out the door. And Vincent seemed to recognize that shift without her saying a word, because when he spoke again, his voice was softer, but no less firm. "Rest," he said, "because when the day comes, you will need to choose again." And Elena knew, without needing to ask, that the next choice would be harder than the first, and that there would be no turning back once it was made. "Some choices do not feel like choices at all," Vincent said, his voice low and steady as the faint gray light of early morning began to press against the edges of the windows, softening the darkness but not removing it. And Elena felt the weight of those words settle into her thoughts as she adjusted slightly in the chair, her body aching from exhaustion she had not allowed herself to feel until now. And Lily rested quietly against her, half awake, half dreaming, her small fingers loosely curled into the fabric of Elena's sleeve as if holding onto something she did not yet understand she might lose. And the room had changed again, not in structure, not in sound, but in presence, the night crowd thinning, replaced by a quieter rhythm that belonged to those who never truly left. Those who understood that places like this did not close, they only shifted, and Vincent remained exactly where he had been, unchanged, untouched by the passage of hours, as if time adjusted itself around him rather than the other way around. And Elena watched him for a moment longer than she intended, trying to understand something that did not present itself easily, something beneath the calm, beneath the control, something that explained why he had allowed her to stay when it would have been simpler, safer, to refuse. And she found herself speaking before she fully decided to. "You knew they would come," she said quietly, and Vincent did not deny it, did not confirm it immediately either, his gaze drifting briefly toward the window before returning to her. "I knew they were looking," he replied, and the distinction mattered, even if she could not yet explain why. And Elena frowned slightly, her voice steady but edged with something more now, something closer to understanding. "And you still let me sit here," she said, and Vincent's expression did not change, but there was a pause, deliberate, before he answered. "You asked," he said simply, and the simplicity of it unsettled her more than anything else, because it meant that something as small as a question had changed the course of everything that followed. And she shook her head slightly, almost to herself. "That is not enough," she said, and Vincent leaned back slightly, his fingers resting loosely against the edge of the table. "It was enough for me," he replied, and the certainty in his voice left no space for argument. Only more questions, and Elena felt them building, pressing against the edges of her restraint. But before she could ask another, a movement near the entrance drew her attention, subtle but noticeable, and Vincent's gaze shifted as well, his focus sharpening in a way that signaled something had changed. And one of his men approached again, his posture controlled but carrying a quiet urgency that had not been present before, and he leaned down, speaking in a low voice that did not carry beyond the table. And Vincent listened, his expression remaining still, but something in his eyes hardened just slightly, not with anger, not with concern, but with recognition. And when the man stepped back, Vincent did not immediately respond, instead allowing the silence to stretch for a moment longer, as if giving the information time to settle into place before acting on it. And Elena watched him, her pulse quickening despite herself, sensing that whatever had been delayed was now moving again, closer, more defined. And when Vincent finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, but carried a weight that made it impossible to ignore. "They are not leaving the area," he said, and Elena felt the words like a shift beneath her feet, subtle but destabilizing, because it meant the moment she had hoped might pass was only changing form, not disappearing, and she tightened her hold on Lily instinctively, her voice steady but edged with urgency. "Then they will come back," she said, and Vincent nodded once, slowly. "Yes," he replied, and there was no hesitation in the answer, no attempt to soften it. And Elena drew in a breath, her mind racing through possibilities that all seemed to lead to the same place, and she looked at him, searching for something she could hold on to. "What do we do?" she asked, and the question felt different this time, not just about survival, but about trust, about alignment, about something she had not expected to find in a place like this. And Vincent studied her for a long moment, his gaze steady, measuring not just her words but the shift behind them, the way she had moved from reacting to deciding, from resisting to engaging. And when he answered, his voice carried that same calm authority, but with something else beneath it now, something more deliberate. "You stop thinking like you are alone," he said, and the words landed with a quiet force that made Elena pause, because she realized she had been doing exactly that. Even here, even after everything that had happened, she had still been planning for herself, for escape, for movement, not for connection, not for reliance. And she held his gaze, her voice softer now, but more certain. "And if I am not?" she asked, and Vincent's lips curved faintly again, that almost smile that suggested understanding rather than amusement. "Then you start acting like it," he replied, and the answer was simple, but it carried a weight that shifted something inside her, something she had been holding onto out of necessity, out of habit, out of fear, and she looked down at Lily for a moment, her fingers brushing gently through her hair, grounding herself again in the one thing she could not afford to risk. And when she looked back up, her expression had changed, steadier, clearer. "Then tell me what to do," she said. And Vincent watched her for a long second, as if confirming the choice behind the words, before he nodded once, slowly, and leaned forward slightly, his voice low, controlled, precise. "For now, you stay exactly where you are," he said. "You do not move unless I tell you, and you do not speak unless I ask." And Elena nodded, understanding that the rules had shifted, that this was no longer about waiting, it was about preparation, and the room around them seemed to tighten again, the quiet rhythm adjusting once more, as if responding to something unseen but understood, and outside the light continued to grow, thin and pale against the glass, marking the arrival of a new day that did not bring relief, only change. And Vincent's gaze moved briefly across the room, checking, measuring, before returning to her, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a finality that settled deep. "Because when they come back," he said, "this will not be about finding you." He paused, just long enough for the weight of what followed to settle into place. "It will be about whether I let them." Control is not about stopping what is coming. It is about deciding how it arrives, Vincent said, his voice low and measured, as the pale morning light grew stronger against the windows, stretching thin across the polished floor and revealing details the night had hidden. And Elena felt the shift immediately, not because anything dramatic had changed, but because everything had become clearer, sharper, less forgiving, and she adjusted slightly in her seat, her body more alert now despite the exhaustion that lingered beneath the surface. And Lily rested quietly against her, fully awake but calm, her small hand still anchored to Elena, as if sensing the importance of staying close. And the room had settled into a new rhythm, quieter but more focused, the kind of stillness that did not relax but prepared, and Vincent's presence seemed to anchor that stillness, his posture unchanged, his gaze moving with quiet precision as he observed the room, not searching, not reacting, but anticipating. And Elena followed his gaze briefly, noticing the subtle shifts she had missed before, the way his men positioned themselves without drawing attention, the way conversations remained low, controlled, the way nothing here felt accidental. And she understood then that what she had walked into was not just a place, it was a system, one that functioned without needing to announce itself. And her voice came softly, more grounded now. "You already knew they would not leave," she said. And Vincent did not look at her immediately, his attention still on the room as he answered, "People who chase do not stop until they are forced to." And the statement carried a quiet finality that made Elena pause, because it meant something was going to happen, not in chaos, not in reaction, but in decision. And she tightened her hold on Lily slightly, her voice steady but edged with concern. "And you are going to force them," she said, and Vincent's gaze shifted back to her, steady, unreadable. "I am going to decide," he replied, and the distinction settled into her, subtle but important, because it meant this was not about confrontation, it was about control, about setting the terms of something that had already begun. And she nodded slowly, understanding more than she wanted to. And the silence between them stretched again, not empty, but filled with the weight of what was coming. And then Lily spoke, her voice small but clear. "Are those the people who were looking for us?" And Elena hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering, "Yes." And Lily considered that, her expression thoughtful in a way that felt older than her years, before she looked at Vincent again. "Will they come inside again?" she asked, and Vincent met her gaze without hesitation, his voice calm. "Only if I allow it," he said, and Lily seemed to accept that answer with the same quiet trust she had shown before, nodding slightly before leaning back against Elena. And Elena watched the exchange, something shifting inside her again, something that felt dangerously close to trust. And she looked back at Vincent, her voice quieter now, but more certain. "You keep saying it is your choice," she said, "but why?" And Vincent did not answer immediately, his gaze holding hers for a long moment, as if weighing not the question but the reason behind it. And when he spoke, his voice was softer, but no less controlled. Because everything that happens here is, he said. And the simplicity of the answer carried a weight that made it clear there was more beneath it, more that he was choosing not to say, and Elena exhaled slowly, realizing that understanding him would not come from direct answers, but from what he chose to reveal in moments like this. And she shifted slightly in her seat, her mind moving through everything that had happened, everything that had changed, and she realized something then, something that settled into her with quiet clarity, that she was no longer just reacting to him. She was beginning to read him, to understand the rhythm of his decisions, the pattern of his control, and it changed the way she looked at him, not as a threat, not as a savior, but as something more complex, something she had not yet fully defined. And before she could speak again, a subtle movement near the entrance drew Vincent's attention, and this time it was different, quieter, more deliberate, and one of his men approached again. But instead of speaking immediately, he paused, waiting, and Vincent gave a slight nod, granting permission without words. And the man leaned in, his voice low, controlled. "They are still outside," he said, waiting. And Vincent listened, his expression unchanged, but something in his stillness sharpened, as if the moment he had been anticipating had finally arrived. And he nodded once, dismissing the man with a simple glance. And then his gaze returned to Elena, steady, focused, and when he spoke, his voice carried a quiet finality that made her sit straighter without realizing it. "They are not leaving," he said, and Elena felt the words settle into her chest, heavy but expected, and she nodded slowly, her voice steady. "Then neither are we," she said, and Vincent watched her for a long second, something shifting in his expression, subtle but real, as if acknowledging the choice she had just made, not out of fear, not out of necessity, but out of understanding. And he inclined his head slightly. "No," he said, "we are not." And the agreement between them settled into place, quiet but significant, and the room seemed to respond to it in ways that could not be seen, only felt, the stillness tightening, focusing, preparing. And outside the light continued to grow, soft but persistent, marking the passage of time that no longer felt neutral. And Vincent leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed but his presence sharper than ever. And when he spoke again, his voice carried that same calm authority, but with something else beneath it now, something that suggested the next moment would not belong to waiting. "Stay with me," he said, and the words were simple, but they carried a weight that made Elena pause, because they were not a command, not exactly, but they were not a request either. They were something in between, something that implied trust, alignment, and consequence all at once. And she held his gaze for a long second before nodding. Once, steady, certain, and Vincent's lips curved slightly again, that almost smile that acknowledged more than it revealed. And he spoke one final time, his voice low, controlled, precise. "Good," he said, "because when they come back in," he paused, just long enough for the moment to settle. "You will not be the one they are looking at." When attention shifts, truth hides in plain sight, Vincent said, his voice calm and deliberate, as the soft morning light stretched further into the room, revealing faces more clearly, movements more precisely. And Elena felt the weight of his words settle into her as she adjusted her posture slightly, instinctively drawing Lily closer, without making it obvious, because she understood now that what mattered was not just where she was, but how she appeared, how she blended into a space that had already decided its rules long before she entered it. And Vincent's gaze moved across the room again, slower this time, more intentional, as if aligning every detail into place, and Elena followed the direction of his attention without turning her head, noticing how the men near the entrance had shifted subtly, how the staff no longer moved freely but with quiet purpose, how even the light itself seemed to sharpen the edges of everything. And then it happened. The door opened again, not suddenly, not violently, but with the same controlled movement as before, and the sound of the outside filtered in for a brief moment before the room reclaimed its quiet, and the figures stepped inside once more, their presence heavier this time, more certain, as if the search had narrowed, as if the waiting had ended. And Elena felt her pulse quicken but did not move, did not look, because Vincent had told her not to. And she understood now that stillness was not weakness, it was protection, and Vincent did not turn immediately, did not acknowledge them right away, instead allowing the moment to stretch, allowing them to enter fully into his space before deciding how to respond. And when he finally lifted his gaze, it was not toward them directly, but across the room, as if the conversation had already been decided before it began. And one of the men stepped forward again, his posture more assertive now, his voice controlled but edged with impatience. "We are not leaving without an answer," he said, and Vincent's expression did not change, his fingers resting lightly against the table, unmoving, and for a moment he said nothing, letting the weight of silence settle into the space between them. And then he spoke, his voice calm, even, carrying without effort. "Then you will be here a long time." And the words did not challenge, did not provoke, but they closed something, a door that had not been visible until that moment, and Elena felt it. The shift, the way the room seemed to tighten again, not with fear, but with alignment, as if everyone present understood exactly where they stood, and she kept her gaze forward, her breathing steady, focusing on the rhythm Vincent had created, the space he controlled, and beside her Lily remained still, unusually quiet, her small hand gripping Elena's sleeve with a soft but constant pressure, and Vincent's eyes flickered briefly toward them, not enough to draw attention, just enough to confirm, to adjust, and then his focus returned to the men at the entrance, and this time he leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed in a way that carried more authority than tension ever could. "You have already asked your question," he said, "and I have already answered." And the man took another step forward, stopping just short of crossing an invisible boundary that seemed to exist around Vincent's table. And Elena realized then that this space was not marked by distance, but by permission, and the man's voice lowered slightly, more controlled now. "We know she is here," he said, and for the first time, the words landed close enough to be felt directly, and Elena felt her chest tighten, but she did not react, did not move, because she understood now that reaction was what they were looking for, and Vincent's gaze sharpened, not outwardly, not dramatically, but in a way that shifted the balance of the moment. "Knowing is not the same as proving," he replied, and the statement carried a quiet finality that made the air feel heavier, and the man hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, as if recalibrating again, as if realizing that the control he thought he held was slipping in ways he could not quite define. And Elena felt it too, that subtle shift of power, not loud, not visible, but undeniable, and she remained still, her focus narrowing to the space in front of her, to the sound of her own breathing, to the presence of Vincent beside her, anchoring the moment in a way she had not expected to trust. And then Vincent moved, not abruptly, not aggressively, but with quiet intention, reaching for the glass once more and lifting it slowly, taking a measured sip before setting it down again. And the simplicity of the action carried a message that required no words, that nothing in this room moved faster than he allowed it to. And when he spoke again, his voice was lower, more deliberate. "If you are here to look," he said, "then look." And the invitation hung in the air, open, controlled, dangerous in its own quiet way. And the man's gaze moved across the room, slower now, more careful, scanning faces, positions, details, and Elena felt the moment stretch, every second longer than the last, her body still, her mind steady, holding on to the understanding that visibility was not about presence, it was about attention, and Vincent had already shifted that, had already redirected it, and the man's gaze passed over her once, briefly, not lingering, not stopping, because there was nothing to catch it, nothing to pull it back. And Elena realized then what Vincent had meant, that she would not be the one they were looking at, not because she was hidden, but because she was no longer the center of the moment. And when the man's attention returned to Vincent, there was something different in his expression now, not certainty, not confidence, but hesitation, and Vincent met it without reaction, his gaze steady, unwavering, and after a long moment, the man stepped back slightly, the tension easing just enough to allow movement again, and the room seemed to exhale, not in relief, but in acknowledgement. And Vincent leaned back once more, his posture unchanged, his presence still defining the space around him, and his voice came again, quiet, final. "You have looked," he said. "Now you decide." And the words carried more than they revealed, more than they needed to. and Elena felt the shift settle into place. The understanding that this was no longer about being found. It was about whether they would risk staying. And as the silence stretched once more, she realized something she had not known before, that safety was not always about leaving. Sometimes it was about standing exactly where you were and letting someone else decide who was allowed to move. Power is not proven when others leave, it is proven when they hesitate, Vincent said quietly, and the words settled into the silence that followed as the men near the entrance remained where they were, no longer moving forward, but not yet stepping away, caught in that fragile space between decision and consequence. And Elena felt it as clearly as if it had been spoken directly to her. The shift from pursuit to uncertainty, from control to doubt. And she held her position exactly as Vincent had instructed, her breathing steady, her gaze unfocused just enough to avoid attention while remaining aware of everything around her. And Lily stayed close, her small presence still and quiet, as if instinctively understanding that this moment required stillness more than anything else. And Vincent did not look at the men again immediately, instead allowing the silence to deepen, to stretch, to become something that pressed against them rather than against him. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, deliberate, carrying a weight that did not need to rise to be heard. "You have two options," he said, and the simplicity of the statement cut through the room more sharply than any raised voice could have. And the man who had spoken before straightened slightly, his posture shifting as if preparing to reclaim something that had already begun to slip. "We are not here for options," he replied, and Vincent's gaze lifted slowly, meeting his without urgency, without resistance, just presence. "Then you are here without understanding," he said, and the words landed with quiet finality, not as an insult, not as a challenge, but as a statement of fact that could not be easily dismissed. And Elena felt the tension tighten again, but differently this time, less about immediate danger and more about the balance that had shifted so completely in Vincent's favor. And she realized then that nothing in this moment was accidental, not the silence, not the words, not even the way he chose to respond. And the man hesitated, just briefly, before speaking again, his voice lower now, more controlled. "We are not leaving without certainty," he said, and Vincent leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed in a way that made the statement almost seem irrelevant. "Certainty is expensive," he replied, and the words carried a subtle weight, something that suggested terms, something that suggested a line that had not yet been drawn. And the man's expression shifted again, calculating now, reassessing, and Elena felt it. That change, the movement from demand to negotiation, from pursuit to consideration, and she remained still, understanding that this was the moment Vincent had been preparing for, not the confrontation, but the decision that followed it. And Lily shifted slightly beside her, her small fingers tightening for just a second before relaxing again, and Vincent's gaze flickered toward them briefly, just enough to confirm, just enough to adjust, before returning to the men at the entrance. And when he spoke again, his voice carried that same calm authority, but with something else beneath it now, something more defined. "You came here because you believed you had leverage," he said, "but you walked into a place where leverage changes." And the statement settled into the room with quiet precision, and the man did not immediately respond, his silence now mirroring Vincent's earlier control, but it was different, less deliberate, more uncertain. And Elena felt the shift deepen, the understanding that whatever power they thought they held outside did not translate here, did not carry the same weight. And Vincent allowed the silence to stretch again before continuing. "If you stay," he said, "you accept my terms." And the words were not raised, not emphasized, but they carried a clarity that made them impossible to misunderstand. And the man's gaze sharpened slightly, his voice measured. "And if we do not?" he asked, and Vincent's expression did not change, but something in his stillness became more defined, more final. "Then you leave without what you came for," he replied. And the simplicity of the answer left no space for interpretation, no room for negotiation beyond what had already been offered. And Elena felt her pulse steady as the moment settled into place, because she understood now that this was no longer about her, not directly. It was about the balance Vincent had created, the structure he controlled, and the choice he had placed in front of them. And she remained exactly where she was, her presence absorbed into the rhythm of the room, no longer standing out, no longer drawing attention, and it was intentional. She could feel it, the way Vincent had shifted the focus entirely, turning the search inward, away from her, and onto something else, something larger, something they could not easily ignore. And the man exhaled slowly, his posture relaxing just enough to signal a decision forming, and he glanced briefly at the others behind him, a silent exchange passing between them, before looking back at Vincent, and for the first time, his voice carried something different, not certainty, not demand, but acceptance. "We will consider your terms," he said, and Vincent inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the shift without pressing it further. "Then you understand," he replied, and the room seemed to ease again, not in relief, but in resolution, as if something had been settled that did not need to be spoken aloud, and the men stepped back slightly, their presence still there, but no longer pressing, no longer demanding. And Elena felt the change as clearly as she had felt the tension before, the movement from pursuit to pause, from urgency to calculation, and she allowed herself a small breath, controlled, steady, because she understood that this was not the end. It was only a transition, and Vincent leaned back once more, his posture returning to that composed stillness that had defined him from the beginning. And when he spoke again, his voice was quiet, but carried a finality that settled deep. "Then take your time," he said, "because I already know how this ends." And the words lingered, not as a threat, not as a promise, but as something in between, something that suggested a certainty she could not yet fully see, but was beginning to believe. "Every agreement reveals what each side is truly afraid of losing," Vincent said, his voice calm and deliberate as the room settled into a quieter tension, one no longer driven by pursuit, but by calculation. And Elena felt the shift immediately, the difference between being chased and being considered, and she remained still, her posture unchanged, her presence absorbed into the controlled rhythm Vincent had created, and Lily rested quietly against her, her small fingers now relaxed, her breathing even, as if the weight of the moment had passed for her, even if it had only transformed for everyone else. And the men near the entrance no longer pressed forward, their stance adjusted, less assertive, more observant, as if they were no longer certain where the lines were drawn, and Vincent did not look at them directly, instead allowing the silence to continue shaping the space, because silence here was not empty, it was deliberate, it carried meaning, and Elena began to understand that more clearly now, that every pause, every delay, every moment without words was part of the control he held, and after a long stretch, one of the men stepped forward again, slower this time, his voice lower, more measured. "If we accept your terms," he said, "what guarantees do we have?" And Vincent's gaze lifted slightly, not fully turning, just enough to acknowledge the question, and Elena felt the subtle shift again, the movement from demand to negotiation becoming more defined, and Vincent leaned back slightly, his fingers resting lightly against the table. "You do not get guarantees," he replied, his tone even, unchanging, and the simplicity of the answer settled heavily into the room. And the man frowned slightly, his voice tightening just enough to reveal the edge beneath his control. "Then why would we agree?" he asked, and Vincent's expression remained unchanged, but something in his stillness became sharper, more precise. "Because you already know your alternative," he said, and the words carried a quiet finality that made the room seem smaller for a moment, and Elena felt it, the narrowing of options, the realization that this was not about what they wanted, but about what they could afford to refuse. And the man hesitated again, his gaze shifting briefly to the others behind him, a silent exchange passing between them before he looked back at Vincent, and for the first time, there was no immediate response, only consideration, and Vincent allowed it, did not interrupt, did not press, because he did not need to. And Elena realized then that he was not forcing a decision, he was guiding it, shaping it, until there was only one direction left, and she remained still, her breathing steady, her focus narrowing to the space in front of her, to the sound of Vincent's voice, to the quiet presence of Lily beside her. And after a moment, the man spoke again, his tone quieter now, less certain. "You are asking us to trust you," he said, and Vincent's gaze shifted slightly, meeting his more directly this time. "No," he replied. I am asking you to understand me. And the distinction settled into the room with quiet weight, and Elena felt it too. The difference between blind faith and clear awareness. And she realized that everything Vincent had done since she arrived had followed that same pattern, not asking for trust, not offering comfort, but presenting reality in a way that could not be ignored. And the man exhaled slowly, his posture relaxing just enough to signal something had shifted, something had been accepted even if it had not been spoken aloud. And he nodded once, slowly. Then we understand, he said, and Vincent inclined his head slightly in return, acknowledging the decision without pressing it further, and the room seemed to settle again, the tension easing into something more stable, more defined, and the men stepped back slightly, their presence no longer pressing against the space, but still present, still aware, as if waiting for the next movement, the next signal. And Elena allowed herself a small breath, controlled, steady, because she understood now that this was not over. It had only changed form, and Vincent leaned back once more, his posture returning to that composed stillness that had defined him from the beginning. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but carried a finality that settled deep. Then we proceed, he said, and the words felt less like a command and more like a confirmation. And Elena felt something shift inside her again, something that moved beyond fear, beyond uncertainty, into something steadier, something that resembled understanding. And she looked at Vincent, her voice soft but clear. And what happens to us? She asked, and for the first time, the question felt different, not desperate, not uncertain, but grounded, as if she was no longer asking from a place of fear, but from a place of readiness. And Vincent turned his gaze to her fully now, his expression unchanged, but his attention sharper, more focused, and he held her gaze for a long moment before answering, his voice low, controlled, precise. That depends, he said, and Elena felt the weight of the words settle into her, because she understood now that nothing here was fixed, nothing here was given, everything was decided, moment by moment, choice by choice. And Vincent's lips curved slightly, that almost smile that suggested something just beyond understanding, and he continued, on whether you are still running. And the question hung between them, not as a challenge, not as a demand, but as something deeper, something that reached beyond the moment, beyond the room, into everything that had brought her here. And Elena held his gaze, her expression steady, her voice quiet but certain. I am not, she said, and Vincent watched her for a long second, as if confirming the truth behind the words. And then he nodded once, slowly, and the room seemed to shift again, not in tension, not in uncertainty, but in alignment, as if something had been decided that could not be undone. And when he spoke again, his voice carried that same calm authority, but with something else beneath it. Now, something more defined, more personal. Then you stay, he said. And the words settled into place with a quiet finality that felt different from before, less like an instruction and more like a beginning. Staying is not the same as belonging, Vincent said quietly, and the words settled into the space between them with a weight that felt different from everything he had said before, less about control, less about decision, and more about consequence. And Elena felt it immediately, the shift from survival to something deeper, something that would require more than just staying still and following instructions. And she held his gaze, her posture steady, her presence no longer hidden but not exposed either, existing in that precise balance he had created around her. And Lily leaned softly against her side, calm now, her earlier tension replaced by a quiet trust that seemed to anchor Elena more than anything else in the room. And the men near the entrance had stepped further back, their presence still noticeable, but no longer pressing, their focus shifting toward Vincent rather than scanning the room, as if the search had ended and something else had begun, something less defined, but more significant. And Vincent leaned back slightly, his posture composed, his gaze moving briefly across the room before returning to Elena, as if confirming that everything remained exactly where it needed to be. And when he spoke again, his voice carried that same calm authority, but with a quieter edge, something more deliberate. You are not here because you were found, he said. You are here because you stayed. And the distinction settled into Elena's thoughts, reshaping the way she understood her own presence in this place. and she nodded slightly, her voice soft but certain. And that changes things, she said, and Vincent's lips curved faintly, that almost smile that acknowledged understanding rather than agreement. It defines them, he replied, and Elena felt the truth of that in a way she could not ignore, because staying had not just protected her, it had aligned her, placed her within something that had rules she was only beginning to understand, and she looked at him carefully, her voice steady. Then what does that make me? She asked, and Vincent did not answer immediately, his gaze holding hers for a long moment, as if measuring not the question but the readiness behind it. And when he spoke, his voice was lower, more precise. That depends on what you choose next, he said, and the answer did not give her certainty, but it gave her direction, and she nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of it, because she understood now that staying had not ended her decisions, it had only made them more important, and the room around them had settled into a quiet equilibrium. The earlier tension replaced by something more controlled, more structured, as if the moment of uncertainty had passed and been replaced by something deliberate. And Elena noticed the subtle movements again. The way Vincent's men adjusted positions without drawing attention. The way the staff continued their tasks without interruption. The way everything seemed to operate within an unspoken system that did not need to be explained to be followed. And she realized then that this was not just a place of power. It was a place of order, and Vincent was the one who defined it, and before she could speak again, Lily shifted slightly, her small voice soft but clear. Mom, are we going somewhere? And the question landed with a quiet weight, because it reached beyond the moment, beyond the room, into something that had not yet been decided. And Elena hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering, her voice gentle, not yet. And Lily accepted that easily, nodding once before settling back against her. And Vincent watched the exchange without comment, but something in his expression shifted, subtle, almost imperceptible, as if the presence of the child altered the way he considered the moment. And when he spoke again, his voice carried that same calm tone, but with a different kind of intention. You will not leave today, he said, and Elena looked at him, not surprised, not resistant, but thoughtful. Because of them? She asked, and Vincent shook his head slightly. Because of you, he replied, and the answer caught her off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because it pointed inward rather than outward, and she frowned slightly. I do not understand, she said, and Vincent leaned forward just enough to close the space between them again, his voice lower now, more deliberate. You are still thinking about escape, he said, and that will make you visible. And the words settled into her with quiet precision, because she knew he was right, even if she had not admitted it to herself, even if part of her still held onto the instinct to move, to leave, to run. And she exhaled slowly, her gaze dropping briefly before returning to his. Then what should I be thinking about? She asked, and Vincent's expression remained steady, but there was something in his eyes now that suggested the answer mattered more than the question. Position, he said simply, and Elena felt the shift in the word immediately, because it was not about movement, it was about placement, about understanding where she stood within something larger than herself, and she nodded slowly, absorbing it. And what is my position? She asked, and Vincent held her gaze for a long moment before answering, his voice calm, controlled, precise. That is what you are about to find out, he said, and the words carried a quiet finality that made it clear this was not a conversation. It was a transition, and Elena felt it, the shift from being protected to being placed, from being hidden to being part of something that required awareness, and she sat a little straighter, her posture adjusting almost instinctively, because she understood now that staying was no longer passive, it was active. It required attention, intention, and choice, and Vincent leaned back again, his posture returning to that composed stillness that defined him. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but no less firm. Everything that happens next will depend on how you stand, he said, and Elena held his gaze, her expression steady, her voice quiet but certain. Then I will stand where you tell me, she said, and Vincent watched her for a long second, something shifting in his expression, subtle but real, as if acknowledging the weight of that choice. And then he nodded once, slowly, and the room seemed to settle again, not in tension, not in uncertainty, but in alignment, as if something had been confirmed that could not be undone. And when he spoke again, his voice carried that same calm authority, but with something else beneath it now, something more defined, more personal. Good, he said. Because from this moment on, where you stand will decide who you become. Some lives change in a single moment. Others change in the quiet decision to stop running. Vincent said, his voice low and steady as the morning light finally settled fully into the room, no longer faint, no longer uncertain, but clear enough to reveal everything without hiding anything, and Elena felt it in. The stillness, the shift from night into day, not as relief, but as clarity, and she sat straighter now, no longer holding herself as someone waiting to leave, but as someone who had already crossed a line she could not step back from, and Lily rested calmly against her side, her small presence no longer tense, no longer searching, as if she too had accepted something that had not been spoken aloud. And the room moved around them with quiet purpose, no longer reacting, no longer adjusting, but continuing, as if whatever had needed to be decided had already been decided, and Vincent remained where he had been, unchanged in posture, unchanged in presence, yet everything around him felt different, as if the space itself had settled into alignment with him. And Elena watched him for a long moment, no longer trying to understand him completely, but recognizing that she did not need to, not yet, because what mattered now was not who he was, but what she had chosen, and she spoke quietly, her voice steady. I am not leaving. And the words felt different this time, not spoken out of fear, not spoken out of necessity, but spoken out of certainty, and Vincent's gaze shifted to her slowly, deliberately, holding her in a way that measured not just her words, but the truth behind them. And for a moment he said nothing, allowing the weight of that decision to settle fully. And then he nodded once, slowly, and the gesture carried more meaning than any response could have, because it was not approval, not permission, but acknowledgement. And Elena felt something settle inside her, something firm, something unmovable. And for the first time since she had stepped into that bar, she was not thinking about what might happen next. She was thinking about what she would do when it did. And Lily looked up at her then, her voice soft but clear. Does that mean we stay with him? And the simplicity of the question made Elena pause, because it stripped everything down to something she could not complicate, could not avoid. And she looked at Vincent, meeting his gaze without hesitation now, without uncertainty, and then back at Lily, her voice gentle but certain. It means we stay where we are safe, she said, and Lily nodded slightly, accepting the answer without question, as she always did. And Vincent watched the exchange quietly, something shifting in his expression, subtle but real, as if the presence of that trust carried a weight he did not ignore. And when he spoke again, his voice was calm, but there was something different beneath it now, something that carried not just control, but responsibility. Safety is not a place, he said. It is a position, and Elena felt the truth of that settle into her, because she understood now that where she stood mattered more than where she went. And she nodded slowly, her gaze steady. Then I will stand here, she said, and Vincent's lips curved faintly, that almost smile that acknowledged understanding without softening it. And he leaned forward slightly, his voice lower now, more precise. Then understand this, he said. Standing here means you are no longer outside what happens next. And the words carried a quiet finality that made Elena's breath steady, not tighten, because she had already accepted it, already chosen it, and she did not look away, did not hesitate. I know, she said, and the certainty in her voice did not go unnoticed, and Vincent held her gaze for a long moment before nodding again, slower this time, more deliberate, and the room seemed to respond to that silent exchange, the quiet rhythm settling deeper, more defined, as if something had been confirmed that could not be undone. And one of his men approached briefly, speaking in a low voice, and Vincent listened, his expression unchanged, before giving a slight nod, dismissing him without a word. And then his attention returned to Elena, sharper now, more focused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried that same calm authority, but with something else beneath it, something that marked the beginning of something new. They will not come back the same way, he said. And Elena understood immediately what he meant, that the pause, the hesitation, the negotiation had not ended anything. It had only changed the form of what was coming. And she nodded once, her voice steady. Then neither will we, she said, and Vincent's gaze held hers, something shifting again, subtle but undeniable, as if he recognized not just the words, but the alignment behind them. And he leaned back slightly, his posture returning to that composed stillness. But his presence felt different now, less distant, more connected to the moment they had just shared, and the light in the room continued to grow, filling the space with clarity that left nothing hidden, nothing uncertain. And Elena looked around briefly, seeing everything differently now, not as a place she had stumbled into, but as a place she had chosen, and she realized then that nothing about this moment had been accidental, not the rain, not the door, not the question she had asked, and certainly not the answer she had received. And Vincent's voice came once more, quiet, final, carrying a weight that settled deeper than anything before it. You did not find this place, he said. You were brought to it by the choice you made when you stopped running. And Elena felt the truth of that in a way she could not deny, because she understood now that everything had led to this, not by chance, but by decision. And she held his gaze, her expression steady, her voice quiet but certain. Then I am exactly where I need to be, she said. And Vincent watched her for a long second, something unreadable passing through his eyes before it settled back into that familiar calm. And he nodded once, slowly, and the gesture carried a finality that marked the end of one thing and the beginning of another. And as the room settled into its new rhythm, as the light fully claimed the space, Elena realized that she had not just survived the night. She had stepped into something she could no longer walk away from. And for the first time, that did not feel like a loss. It felt like a beginning. And somewhere in the quiet that followed, Vincent's voice echoed once more, softer now, almost reflective. Some people spend their lives searching for a place to belong, he said. Others find it the moment they decide to stop leaving. And the words lingered, not as a conclusion, but as something deeper, something that would continue long after this moment had passed. Because some stories do not end when the danger fades, they begin when the running stops.